Right, aloha. Hi, Ray.
Aloha.
How are you?
I'm good.
Well, thanks for.
Happy first week of 2021.
Oh, yeah, 2021. Can you believe it?
No,
I'm not sure
it's
it feels like a
amazing.
new year just yet.
Yes. No, I think I'm just sprinting out of 2020, but I don't know what we're going into.
Right. Well, welcome and thank you for being our first guest on Conservation Conversations Hawaii. I'm
Yay.
so excited to talk to you because we've known each other for, I don't know, it's at least 15 years now.
hmm
Yeah, and we've done a lot of work together. So, all right. So, I want to hear all about your adventures because you were here on Maui with an organization called Malama Maui Nui, and now you're living on Hawaii Island and working all across the state. So, tell me what you've been up to.
Wow. I left Maui in 2013, which now sounds like a very long time ago. It was to go to law school, and I graduated in 2016. And actually, while I was in law school, I was working for the Native Hawaiian Law Program and Professor Kapua Sproat. And she got contacted by an organization called Waterkeeper Alliance, who I had never heard of before. But they reached out to her and were interested in creating a waterkeeper program in the Hawaiian Islands. And they were looking for somebody who would have a skill set with both nonprofits and the potential legal issues that could come up, as well as sensitive environmental and cultural issues. And they asked if somebody might be at the law school or if Kapua might know of anyone. And luckily, I was working for her at the time, and she knew that I had come from a nonprofit before, and she recommended me. And so I started with Waterkeepers in 2016.
Let's go
And
back a little bit just for our viewers so
sure,
who may have never heard of Waterkeepers before. So, Waterkeepers Alliance was started by Robert F. Kennedy Jr. That's pretty major, right? So
yeah,
it's an international organization. So, can you give just a quick rundown of what Waterkeepers as an organization is interested in?
absolutely. So the mission of the entire organization is fishable, swimmable, drinkable water. They have over 350 member organizations who are themselves their own nonprofits in 350 locations around the world in 47 countries, all
Wow,
fighting for the same mission, clean water.
right.
And so we actually were the first waterkeeper in the Hawaiian Islands, but actually the very first waterkeeper that ever got started was the Hudson River Keeper in the 1960s, even before there was a Clean Water Act. And just a band of individuals who wanted to do something positive for their river that they saw the water quality diminishing over time, set basically the stage for many other organizations to come after them. And Robert F. Kennedy Jr. came to this group and reorganized it in about 20 years ago to be the alliance that we know today with all the individual
Right.
organizations.
It makes so much sense to have a water keepers alliance in Hawaii because we're surrounded by the ocean. And of course, we have
That's right.
many streams and bodies of water that connect the land and the ocean. So it's only fitting that we have an organization that is focused on making sure our waters are drinkable, fishable, swimmable. That's an easy thing to remember for everybody. So
Thank you.
that's great. So you're working the islands. I know you have sort of projects and programs going around throughout the state of Hawaii.
hmm
So, can you give a quick rundown of that? We'll go into a little more depth about the Oyster program. I definitely want to talk about that. But if you can
Sure.
talk about the different islands that you're doing work on and in general, what are the things that you call your local organization by Viola?
That's right.
Waterkeeper Hawaiian Islands. So
Yes.
it's
Yes.
nice that there is that Hawaiian connection to the
Yes.
to this international organization. So in
Thank
Hawaii,
you.
where are you working?
In Hawaii, we're working primarily on Oahu. We have Oahu Waterkeeper as well as Hilo Bay Waterkeeper and Kona Coast Waterkeeper. In addition, we have been supporting the project on Maui that you know, the Maui Nui Marine Resource Council project with the oysters. And we also have some oysters at Nomilo Fish Pond on Kauai. So we have projects in every county. But the goal really is to get the focus on what is affecting our water quality. So in addition to the Oyster project, we're doing things that draw attention to land-based sources of pollution. So storm drain stenciling, water quality testing, trying to figure out what sources of wastewater are entering our nearshore waters. So we're using actually 3 different methods to detect wastewater. One of them is Enterococcus, which is the method that DOH uses. And we're also trying something very new called sucralose monitoring. Sucralose is a chemical that is made from essentially fake sugar, so like sweeteners. And it's found in 400 products carried in stores.
I've heard
And
of it.
the sucralose chemical is very stable. And so I'm sure you're familiar with people using caffeine as a marker for wastewater to try to detect, essentially to distinguish human wastewater from animal wastewater. And that's a big difference because we cannot get sick from, say, a whole lot of cattle egrets contributing to bacteria levels in the nearshore water.
Right.
But if it is human sources of wastewater, then that's the kind of thing that could potentially make us sick. Unfortunately, Enterococcus, the type of parameter that DOH uses doesn't actually tell us whether it's human or animal.
Let's make sure that our viewers know DOH is the Department of Health. So we have a state Department of Health.
Oh,
I know we're used to using acronyms all the time, but kind of gets lost for a lot of people who aren't in the know.
You're so right. And so the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, has certain parameters, federal regulations that determine what water quality standards can be. The state is able to actually make those more stringent, but they cannot make them less than what the federal government is recommending. So the EPA delegates authority over water quality to the Department of Health. So DOH monitors our Enterococcus levels, and occasionally you'll see that a beach gets shut down for the bacteria being too high. And so one of the things that we're interested in is it cattle egrets or is it humans? And in several cases where we very highly suspect it is human waste due to sucralose levels and optical brighteners, which is another type of parameter that we use, we then are looking MALCA to say, well, where is this coming from? Is it coming from cesspools? Is it coming from a broken sewer line, leaking septic tanks, that kind of thing?
Yeah, it's interesting that you talked about the waste and that bacteria coming from humans or birds, because I think this is where people sometimes don't know about the connection between wildlife and the resource. And so, for instance, it's interesting that you're talking about cattle egrets, but our native seabirds, their role in the ecosystem and virtually their poop adds nutrients, necessary nutrients to the ocean ecosystem. And so when you have the bird population declining, that affects the quality of the water, in the ocean. And so that's not a connection that people make a lot of time, but that's why we have this show today to talk about it. But that's human waste, on the other hand, that's a different story that causes different impacts.
That's right. But I'm glad you said that, because actually Enterococcus is naturally occurring in the Hawaiian environment. And so that test is a little problematic. And we're hoping that in the future we can move to something that is very precise, that will tell us, is it human or is it animal? And actually the country of Sweden has already moved to using sucralose as their wastewater indicator for their nation.
It's a very important distinction, because it always has to come back to the science, and because you want to make the right decisions, the right management decisions. And so that clearly should be based on some scientific data and evidence.
Yeah.
Which is an important part of your work, I would imagine.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. I want to talk about the Oyster program. I know it's only one component of the work that Waiwai does, but it's such a fascinating project that I think a lot of people would be interested in hearing about, and maybe even getting involved as a volunteer. But first, because you're such a fascinating person, we've known each other, as I said, quite a long time now, and have worked together on many different kind of projects. So let's just get to know you a little bit more. I have a list of 10 questions. They're going to be very rapid fire question answer kind of thing. And so you do your best to answer the question, and you can say pass, but I think you're a quick thinker. You don't need to pass on too many of these. So we're gonna start. Are you ready? This is called Fast Kind Get to Know You. Are you ready?
Okay.
All
Yes.
right, here we go. What high school did you go to?
John F. Kennedy High School in Sacramento,
Wow.
California.
And now you're
Yes.
working for his brother, Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
Right.
Wow. It was meant to be. So, what college did you attend and what was your degree?
Manoa. And
Woohoo.
I went in as an animal science major. And to be honest, I'm not so great at chemistry. So I had to change my major.
Uh oh.
And I was thinking about all the things that I'm passionate about. And I started taking a lot of Hawaiian studies classes and a lot of Hawaiian language classes. And then my parents encouraged me to take something like just a little bit broader. So I ended up majoring in ethnic studies, which is the study of cultures in Hawaii. And I learned, I think, a lot of really great tools to work with our very diverse community.
It sounds like it. It sounds very fitting for the work that you've been doing as long as I've known you. And of course, you went on to get a law degree, which is so cool. That's not something I was expecting to hear from you one day, an announcement that you're going to law school. But I think Hawaii is going to be so much better with you becoming an environmental lawyer. And I think there's just a whole world of possibilities now for you that's going to really benefit our environment here. But let's go
Thank
on
you.
with the questions. What's your favorite food? Because we've had
Oh my
shared many
gosh.
meals together. What's your favorite food?
Oh wow. I'm gonna go with oxtail soup.
Oh,
I have had just I there's no words to describe the oxtail soup that I've had in my lifetime. I'm very lucky. My popo actually had a very special recipe.
she did.
Um, and so I would have to go with that. A close second might actually be cheesecake. So that's
Okay.
the whole spectrum, but that's me.
All right. Well, you know I've made oxtail soup with your proposed recipe. I'm gonna need to dig that out one day and try that again. I'm almost scared to try it again because it came out so well the first time, but I need to try that again. So,
Yes.
who inspires you to be your best self?
Oh my gosh. So I not just one person. You are one of those people. I would say that my upbringing, my grandparents, my grandfather was so um,
Big influence.
truly passionate, yes, about conservation, about culture, about what's right, about doing something. I think that really activated me at a young age. And the planet is a big influence. I think it's interesting to grow up at this time. I'm kind of in the middle of, I remember the older generation and the things that they did and the ways that they lived. I can see the newer generation and things that are happening. And meanwhile, we have this planet that is not the same for the
Right.
older generation
Right.
as it is for the new generation. So I would say I'm very highly motivated by just what's happening on
Right.
Earth
Your
at the moment.
grandfather, bless his soul, he was such a big influence on you. And, I remember him well. And even though you graduated from high school on the mainland, I know you spent all your summers on Hawaii Island. So that was really special and influential on you, I'm sure. Okay, next question, because we have more. So, what is the most, and just pick one, what is the most fascinating place you've ever been to?
Oh my gosh. Fascinating place I've ever been to. Fascinating. Probably China. I would
Wow.
have to say China. Fascinating. I mean, truly spectacular artistry and ancient civilization whose monuments and temples are still around. I mean, I think that in America, we just don't build things to last the way that they did in
Right.
China. It was
Did you see the
so
Great Wall?
timeless. I did. I saw the Great Wall,
Wow.
and so many other incredible cities, and just a huge scale of life experience. I think that was fascinating just to see how people live in different places. It was
Right.
an incredible
And
trip.
to see what the state of their society is today, I think that was also impactful on you, as I remember. What's the
Yeah.
biggest risk you've ever taken?
Risk. Oh my gosh. Risk. Oh wow.
There are probably a few, I'm imagining.
I think I've taken a few risks. Um, Going to law school. I think I really was so happy in my job. I think you might remember there was a time I was working at Malama Maui Nui, and we did such wonderful work in the community.
You
I mean,
did.
we had 10,000 volunteers a year. We were doing in some years 300 projects a year. I mean, it was an incredible time. And between my board and the staff and the community, it was just a wonderful experience.
Right.
And I remember being in my first year of law school saying, "What did you do to yourself? Like, you had such a beautiful life."
Well,
And
it was a
so,
big your departure from Malama Maui Nui and Maui was huge. And if anybody knows the organization Malama Maui Nui, they are the ones who would go out and remove the graffiti, that the bad graffiti, not the good kind, because there's good kind, right?
yeah,
But
yeah,
the negative graffiti that was on walls, and they would go and paint over them and do a lot of highway beautification, picking up tons and tons of litter and marine debris, and
yeah.
a lot of you were on the early part of getting community gardens started, and a lot of different things that you did, and or the paint recycling program. So instead of dumping your paint in the landfill, you could take it to Malamama Nui. They would take all the good paint and make it available for free to anybody who wanted it. And, the programs go on, and you did a lot.
Yeah.
But let's get to the next question. Name something that's currently on your bucket list.
Oh my gosh, my bucket list. I feel like traveling ever again is on my bucket list. I mean, 2020 was so hard. It kind of shortened the list of places I wanted to see. I was like, well, if I can just get to,
The
now
store and
I'm
back.
feeling like,
That's
yeah. But I think my bucket list is Europe. There's still places in Europe that I would really love to see, and Iceland in particular. I would really love to see the aurora borealis. And you have to be very north in order to see it, but I think that would be spectacular.
okay. I'm going to ask you one more, and then we're going to move on to the Oyster Project, and we'll come back to some of these other questions because you're so fascinating. I know there's a lot more that you can share. But one more question before we move on. How did you become interested in conservation as a profession?
My grandfather. I think because he was the water supervisor for irrigation on the plantations, and he took that kuleana very seriously. That the water, was for the community, and that they should absolutely conserve. I remember we had to take 3-minute showers for my childhood, and anytime I was at his house, and it's so cold in Volcano.
It is.
A 3-minute shower is not long enough to get warm. And
Right.
so my grandpa would be like knocking on the door if my shower went over 3 minutes, because he was such a conservationist.
Well,
And today I smile and
well,
thank
in
him.
Volcano, you're also on catchment, right?
That's right.
So you have to
That's
take quick
right.
showers.
Yes. But he had a second catchment tank at his house because he was also the volunteer firefighter
Yes.
for the city of Volcano, because they didn't have a fire station in the beginning. So he had a hydrant and a catchment tank just in case anybody had to put out a fire. So more so, we
Always
couldn't use water.
prepared. Always prepared. And he was my first aid CPR instructor many times, and he was still to this day, I think, the instructor I enjoyed the most because he really took what he was teaching seriously. So I want to talk about the Oyster program as part of what Waiwai Ola does. And you sent me some great pictures that we're going to be putting up. But so you're putting native oysters or growing native oysters to, for lack of a better word, plant back in the ocean so that they
Yeah.
can grow and be the natural cleansers of the ocean and increase water quality. Is that it in a nutshell?
That's right. So I think of it as both a natural and cultural resource restoration.
Absolutely.
The oysters were a part of a very long history of our people's connection to the environment. And actually, there were more than 200 species of native shellfish in the Hawaiian Islands, and
Wow.
today we know so few of them.
Hmm.
And so this is an example of a true oyster that was very rare to find in some locations on Oahu. And so we were able to harvest the wild oysters under a permit from the Department of Land and Natural Resources, take them to Hilo, to the Pacific Aquaculture and Coastal Resources Center, and then have them uh, reproduce basically in an aquaculture laboratory over there, to high enough numbers that we could bring them back to those places on Oahu where they came from and restore them. And so, in addition to the fact that we want to see this bivalve in the water because it should be there, it's a part of the ecosystem. We know that oysters have this amazing ability to filter particulate matter out of the water. And so they have been used all over, in fact, the United States, particularly on the East Coast, but also in the Gulf Coast and on the West Coast, for water quality remediation. In some cases on the East Coast, people actually get a tax write-off for putting oysters out on their own docks because they're helping to contribute to a water quality benefit.
Mm-hmm. So, what do you think led to the decline of native oysters in Hawaii? I would imagine that consumption would be a big factor, but there could be others. What do you think?
Sure. I think that poor water quality, and in fact, sediment is probably the biggest issue. So what happens, because, they are typically found on the floor level of the ocean, sticking to rocks and on that benthic level, if a huge amount of sediment comes in, then essentially they get smothered underneath that. And so unfortunately, in areas like Pearl Harbor and even Kaneohe, where oysters were once abundant, and in fact, where pearl oysters once made oyster reefs, the only natural oyster reefs in Hawaii, actually, besides the one Pearl Hermes reef in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, were found at those two locations. And unfortunately, both of those areas had heavy sediment due to development and agriculture. And so unfortunately, anytime you grade a lot, in that land use, that sediment in a big storm will wash into the water, and then suddenly, everything on the bottom is silty and covered.
So Pearl Harbor was named so for the oyster population. Is that correct?
Yes.
So
Isn't that amazing? So
yeah, I don't think that's something people think about ever, but
No.
we know it as Pearl Harbor, and we grew up knowing it as Pearl Harbor, and where the military has a lot of activity there, but really not making the connection again to the history and the culture and the fact that there were native oysters abundant there once. So these native oysters are very fascinating looking. They're really cool. And I have another picture here that you sent of the Pacific oyster that looks very different, but you have used Pacific oysters in some areas, and can you tell me the reason for that?
Sure, yes. So the native oyster and the pearl oyster, when I talk about them, I talk about both of them, but I don't mean to say that the pearl oyster isn't native. The pearl oyster is also native. The Pacific oyster is not native.
Where is it from?
It is actually from Japan, but it is most heavily cultured on the west coast of the United States. It is almost the number one food oyster if you're going to go out and order it at an oyster bar. But the reason why we use the Pacific oyster is actually a few reasons. One, it is so big. I mean, it's a very large oyster. It can grow to be the size of your hand, as opposed to the Hawaiian oyster would be less than the size of your palm. Even at a maximum capacity, you could probably put 3 oysters in your palm. So when you talk about filtration, and really it's the larger the oyster, the more filtration.
Right. Makes sense.
Typically, yes, the restoration projects on the East Coast are done with an Eastern oyster, which is almost exactly the same size as the Pacific oyster. And so people typically use an oyster of that size. In addition, the Pacific oyster was actually brought into the Hawaiian Islands in the 1800s by the whalers who wanted to introduce it as a potential food source. And then it was reintroduced to the Hawaiian Islands by the Department of Land and Natural Resources in the 1950s as a fish and game enhancement.
Also as a food resource potential?
As a food resource, yes. And so back then it was still okay to just directly eat oysters out of the water. But subsequently in 1991, between 1991 and 1993, shellfish sanitation laws changed, and it is illegal today to actually harvest an oyster out of the water because oysters are so sensitive to water quality that the government didn't want to encourage people actually eating them and getting sick.
Right. So we actually had an incident off of Maui where somebody decided to help themselves to the oyster cages. And
Yes,
I don't know if those oysters were ever located, and I hope nobody ate them or tried to sell them
yes,
to somebody for food. But
yes. It was, it was a very sad incident, and unfortunately, that did happen. Though the cages were labeled, they said toxic, do not eat. Part of an experiment. And unfortunately, people took them anyway. But there are still many, many other oysters actually in Ma'alaya. The project does continue. There was no indication that anybody got sick, and there was no indication that they were sold. So
mhm.
hopefully, that does not happen again. I know that cameras have been installed, so beware anybody who wants to try and steal them in the future. People are watching the oysters.
It
Um,
was all over social media immediately, and I know a lot of people shared the post, so I think word got out really quickly. I think
mhm.
one, people were upset that here's this great project that is helping the environment, and somebody would go and take them for either economic gain or maybe to eat them. But I
Yes,
think people were equally concerned that some people would get sick if they tried to eat them. Um,
absolutely.
yeah. So how long
And
does it?
I would just say that Maui Nui Marine Resource Council did a really good job handling that situation
Yes.
because, it that is one of the downsides, to trying to put something out is that people could steal them, but they did not get discouraged, and in fact, they're continuing, and they've had such good results.
It's
So thank
interesting how
you.
they even knew the oysters were there, but I know you have a lot of volunteers that work with you as students, and it's such a great opportunity for to involve students and get get them in the water or helping with the management of the cages and seeing this is better to learn this way than from a textbook. So what a great
Yeah.
opportunity. But how long does it take for? I know when the oyster is I guess seeding. I don't know if that's the right term, but when they are seeding and because you can reuse the empty oyster shells, right? And a new oyster will grow in it. And how long does that process take?
Well, so where we are hoping to get to is that we reuse the empty oyster shell and put more larvae in,
Larvae.
and
That's the
start
word.
and start to. So it's either called larvae or spat, oyster spat. And so the East Coast project, the Billion Oyster Project, which some people are familiar with, they're actually growing all their oysters on oyster shell and putting it out on the shell. We are growing our oysters in the lab and putting our oysters out directly as the whole oyster. And so oysters typically live anywhere from 3 to up to 20 years.
Wow.
And so, yeah, they have a very long lifespan. And what we've noticed is that they attract each other. And so, typically, actually, that's how oyster reefs were formed.
Mm-hmm.
Oysters like shell to settle on top of, it's their favorite
Right.
substrate. And so, the pearl oyster reefs were formed by oysters settling on top of each other, and we want to encourage that kind of behavior in the future.
Right. So very important for our viewers. If you're in Hawaii, it's not legal to harvest and eat the oysters, but they're also please leave them there because providing a very important ecosystem service, right? Cleaning
That's
our
right.
waters, right? But I want to talk a
Mhm.
little bit more about the. I don't know if you have interns or students coming out to help you or community organizations even, and if you want to
That's right.
share more what they do when they come out to help.
Absolutely. So there has been a lot of interest from young people, and in particular, I would say the pandemic was interesting in that a lot of our college students came home, even if they were going to mainland colleges. And so we had a lot of college interns during 2020, as well as some high school students who were very interested in the Oyster Project. So they are doing a range of things from taking care of the cages, counting the oysters, measuring their growth, handling the data.
Oh,
in
cool.
addition to putting out new types of settling techniques, trying to figure out how we can grow the oyster restoration in more sustainable ways. They're even looking at different types of cages. In particular, Iolani School has joined the oyster restoration around the Alawai, and they're innovating
That's a major
different
cleanup.
types. It is. It is. It's such a great personal responsibility moment, I feel, for our community to realize we're all contributing to what's happening in the Alawai. But Iolani School has really shown a lot of leadership, and their students are trying to design different types of cages, different ways to monitor water quality. And all of it, like you said, gets them thinking about these issues that affect the community in ways that a textbook really just wouldn't do the
Right.
same,
And
and so it's
yeah,
amazing.
you know what I find really cool about this is not only are the students able to, get this experience in their own backyard and doing real science and also innovation, right? But they're also learning and understanding that the answers are right here because we're using a resource that is from here,
Hmm.
and they just need to malama it, to take care of it
That's right.
and nurture it, and it can become a viable solution for that's going
That's
to
right.
be helpful for the future.
Well, and I think about that also. I think about the fact that so our name Viola, I actually chose the name Viola because I really wanted to have an understanding of that term vai. It means wealth or rich, right? But truly, what is it that makes us rich? We cannot eat our money.
Right.
We have to have food and water and shelter, right?
And that
And
became so clear in this pandemic. I think what's really
absolutely.
important:
Oh my
food,
gosh,
water, and
and
shelter.
so Viola is that our richness is alive, right? That our
Hmm.
water is clean, that our food is abundant. And that I think that the oysters are a really good metaphor for that because, like you said, ecosystem services. The oysters are only one thing that are missing from our ecosystem. There are many holes, as you know, in the great matrix of our ecosystems. And unfortunately, some of those contributing animals or plants had such beneficial roles in the environment, like the oysters filtering water, sea cucumbers also
Right.
filter water at the
Okay.
sediment
The
level.
loli. Hmm.
Yes, exactly. And a kuli, the wetland plant, can uptake heavy metals. And
Right.
so I feel like all of these things, when we leave the system to what it originally was, the Mother Nature, Papa Moku, had such a beautiful plan, and so the humans
Mm,
came and we disrupted things.
right.
But just like the humans are a part of the problem, I
Hmm.
think this project illustrates how the humans can be part of the solution.
Right. And it's great that the students are learning this at a young age. And it would,
Yes.
it'd be great if they learned it even at a younger age and kind of grew up with this concept, as part of their natural thinking and perspective
Yes.
on the environment. Do
Yes.
oysters need or what other plants or marine life do they coexist with that they kind of need, like symbiosis? How did is there anything that they need to be kind of in harmony and to produce at their highest potential?
Well, that's a great question. So we've actually found that they rely really on each other, and so oyster reefs are built with other oysters. Generally, the other animals in the ecosystem are predators to the oysters, and so things like crabs, certain types of fish, birds, monk seals, octopus, they will all eat the oyster. And so oysters are excellent hiders of in tiny crevices. Oftentimes you'll find the biggest oyster in like a rock wall or in a wedge between a rock. So rather than depending on other animals, I would say they depend on natural features, and they depend a lot on rocks. I mean, truthfully, rocks are almost an endangered species, in our
Mm-hmm.
environment. In some of those areas where sedimentation has taken over,
Right.
you can't find a rock anywhere because there's silty, dirt, all
Right.
mixing in the water. And so if you're an oyster and you desperately need substrate to settle on, you only have 3 days. You only have 3 days as a viable little tiny larvae to find something to settle on. And if there's no rocks where you were born, then you are not going to
That
continue
almost
your
sounds
life.
like a survivor show for oysters.
Seriously.
You know, hurry up and you have 3 days to
Seriously.
find a home, otherwise you're
You have
gonna perish.
you have 3 days to find a home. And if it was a big rain and there's tons of runoff, good luck with that, right? I
Y-
mean, it's just
right.
sad.
You mentioned the word substrate, and it made me immediately think about the opihi, the limpets that we love,
Hmm.
and with climate change and sea level rise, I often wonder what's going to happen to them when
Oh
the
yeah.
substrate that they depend on that might be in the splash zone is completely
Hmm.
submerged. What's going to
Yes.
happen?
Yes.
Do they find artificial substrates to exist on, or do they become extinct? I don't know. I guess time will
Yeah.
tell, and hopefully we can
Yeah.
do things to slow down that whole sea level rise process. So
Absolutely.
if anyone wants to get in touch with Viviola and get involved, you don't have to be a student or part of an organization, right? You can be somebody who just cares and is interested in this project. And how would they get in touch with you?
Absolutely. Our website is actually waterkeepershi.org. So that stands for Waterkeepers Hawaiian Islands.org. And on our website, you can go to the contact page, and you can let us know how you would like to be involved, as well as if there's any issues taking place in the water. I ask people to reach out to us to let us know what they're seeing, something strange. This past summer in Kona, we had many algal blooms, and they appeared, as floating masses of seaweed on the surface. And some people thought that we had wastewater spills left and right. And so at that time, really, it was actually just a buildup of nutrients causing different types of plants in the ocean to really just become overabundant. And so when we see things, we also like to help people understand what's going on, because sometimes it's not always as bad as we think it is.
Right. That kind of makes me think about, for the average person who doesn't do conservation work as a job, and who maybe has never been introduced to it by, so fortunate to be introduced to it by a grandparent or a parent. You know, w- can you help me answer this question for people? Why should people care about saving the oysters or growing the oysters, or even using them to improve our water quality? How does that relate to the average person who maybe doesn't even go down to the ocean?
Sure. That's a great question. I think that there was a time when conservation was almost an option. It was like a career option. It was a societal option. But I think we are now moving into a phase of this planet's existence where conservation is mandatory. We are either going to make it on the planet by making good choices, or we are not going to make it on the planet. And I think that so suddenly it becomes, what can I do right now to make sure that the next generation is going to have a chance to experience this world the way that I did? And so I think the oyster restoration is an example of something people can do, because certainly many things are out of our hands, many things, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
But I think that getting involved in something like the oyster restoration then leads to understanding what is in our water and why did it get there. And oftentimes you just have to ask and work your way backwards to figure out what the sources of pollution are. And so we don't think that the oysters are going to solve all our problems. We know that the oysters alone cannot make the difference in the water, but we know that they are teaching us what's happening in the environment and showing us what we do need to fix. So I think that Kuleana really just comes back to us,
Hmm.
as to the type of life that we would like to have. And even if you don't feel very warm and fuzzy about the planet, other people feel warm and fuzzy about the economy. And that's a great thing to feel warm and fuzzy about
Oh,
too.
yes.
And if you
Everybody's
care
feeling it
about
now. Mm-hmm.
that's right. And so if you care about the economy, especially in Hawaii, then you know that water quality is essential to us remaining a very important tourist destination in the world, right? But
Mm-hmm.
people come here because it's beautiful. And so if
Right.
we want to maintain that, and we all in some way are affected by the economy, then we have a responsibility to take care of our
Right.
environment.
And you know, the world is a big place, and your influence can be only so far reaching, right?
Yeah.
But like you said, it starts here at home and doing what we can here, because I think Hawaii really is sort of that example of, if we don't take care of our environment, certain consequences happen, and and they happen pretty quickly. And then
Hmm.
if you try to, you know, put the work into bring it back and restore it, it takes a lot of effort, a lot of expense, and you know, and I think that's just a good example to the rest of the world, right? But it starts here at home, and so you know that phrase, "think globally, act locally," is such a great phrase, because it's. I think in Hawaii, we just that's our way of life. That's how we need to think.
Yes, I agree. And thank you for all the things you do for conservation to try and further the future generation. Because if people don't care, then things won't change, right?
Right.
And so the fact that you are inspiring people to care about things really truly means that we have hope moving forward. And I really appreciate that.
You know, I'm kind of laughing because I didn't have anyone in my family who worked in conservation as a profession, and I'm trying to think about where I even got interested in the environment. And really, it was my backyard growing up was Lake Wilson on Oahu
Hmm.
in Wahiawa town, and our backyard was the lake, and leading down to the lake was a lot of ironwood trees, and you know, that was kind of our little playground and place to have, you know, adventures and things like that. And it was not native by any means at all, so it didn't have to be a
Yeah.
beautiful native forest for me to fall in love with the outdoors and to kind of connect with something that told me this is what I want to do when I grow up. I wanted to be a forest ranger before I even knew what a forest ranger was. And so
Wow.
it doesn't have to be something really spectacular and
Mhm.
pristine that really can inspire you.
That's right. That's right. Nature is so inspirational. I think at the smallest tiny plant to me has such mighty potential. I think all of it is really inspiring.
It can be that little bug that lands on your arm, and you know,
Yeah.
you never know. I mean, I think it's different for everybody.
Hmm.
Yeah. So, you know, we mentioned the pandemic a couple of times now, and of course, it's still in our faces right here. We don't know how long this is going to be with us. It's impacted everyone, and we all can't wish for this to go away faster. But I want to ask you, what have you learned about yourself during this pandemic? I think it's really
Wow.
interesting how everybody has responded to the pandemic, and everybody has done so in so many different ways. And but how what have you learned about yourself?
Oh my gosh.
Deep
I've
question.
learned I've learned very personal things about how I operate, even like around other people in a small environment. I think that it put us in our house, with whoever was in our bubble, and there was no escape, right? You couldn't go on a trip, you couldn't really go outside, and so I think that I got to see my own behavior, my own relationships to people. And I learned a lot, I think, about taking care of myself more than I had before. I think the value of doing that is so in our face now. I mean, if anything, we should take good care of ourselves just in case something happens and we get the virus and our body is in a better shape. I mean, I feel like there's a lot of inspiring reasons to take care of yourself in 2020. But I think that I realized more that idea that if you don't take care of yourself, that everything that you love doesn't matter,
Right.
and so I think I embraced that a lot more, and in 2020 I'm trying to implement that.
That's great. Because
2021.
sometimes when you're as busy as I know you are, there has to be something that just forces you to stop and slow down and come to those kind of realizations. But I wanted to, I asked you to send me a picture of,
Yeah.
that place right now that it's, I kind of think of it as a virtual walkabout. You know how people just, everybody has a place. I think they really think about it. Has a place that they need to go to or want to go to when they need to be grounded and they need to remember what's important in life and what makes them feel good, and just that place where they're feel safe, I guess,
Mhm.
and they can regroup. And so I asked you to send me a picture of where that place is for you, and you sent me a bunch of plants that you put in the ground. And so you
Yeah.
want to talk about that?
Absolutely. So, when you ask me where do you go to get grounded, it's funny because I don't leave my house. So where I go to get grounded has to be somewhere on the property. So I actually started a garden back in March, and probably late March. I realized that I think I was watching too much CNN. You can
Mm.
actually maybe watch too much news, I
Oh yeah,
learned.
I think so.
And it was like saturated in my body. I had so much anxiety back then in late March. Nobody knew what was going to happen, and so I just was like, I'm in a garden. And so I went outside, and I got my area together, and I started getting some garden boxes because unfortunately my yard even has no soil. So I had to start from an even higher degree of difficulty,
Oh, did you have to buy
and bring
soil?
soil. I did have to buy soil. I actually tried to go through Hilo first and see if there's an ag program and I could buy soil from them, and everything on hold, with the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
So I ended up buying organic soil and starting my plants. And I found such peace in the act of planting the seeds, watering them, watching them grow. I even learned about. I feel like I learned about relationships from plants, because if you plant two things too close together, they both are not gonna thrive.
They need their space.
People, they need their space, and I feel like we as individuals, we do need our space. And then I have seen what plants will do to make it. I mean, I my tomato plant, when it started to make very big tomatoes, parts of the leaves would just fall off, because the plant is prioritizing, the direction it wants to grow in and send all of its energy to. And to me, I think, yeah, you can't do everything at once. Like you can't grow in all directions, right?
Somehow
You have
I'm
to.
visualizing you writing a book where you're giving voices to these different plants and
Yes.
vegetables and what their experience is like growing up.
Absolutely. I can I can feel that. I feel like I could do that. I feel like I can feel what they're going through. And so but just that idea of really prioritizing where you're gonna place your energy, I swear I learned that from the tomato plant. And so so much of the gardening experience, when you're doing something, touching the soil, I feel like people just making a moment for nature will change your day, because I'll be out there in the garden and a butterfly will come past me or a dragonfly. And there's such a sense of peace and inspiration, and really anything is possible when you're in that space, because planting is really like possibilities and potential, right? Every seed is a new experience. And so I've had the great fortune to watch my seeds grow all the way up to be able to eat many of the things that I grew in my garden, and feed them to my family. And it's something that even my family members have enjoyed getting involved in.
Well,
So
that
it's been
must
a
feel
lot of
good.
fun.
You're feeding your family with what you
Hmm.
did with your own two hands. That's great.
Yeah, it
Awesome.
is amazing.
So, what's in store for Vaivaiola in 2021? I know we're in this pandemic still, and for the foreseeable future, we might be
Yeah.
having some restrictions on what we can do. But what's in store for 2021, and how are you going to, navigate that? with, restrictions?
Absolutely. Well, it continues to be difficult, but a lot of hopeful things are happening at the same time. I mean, we just had a new change of administration throughout the state, a lot of new mayors,
Mm-hmm.
particularly on Oahu and on the Big Island where we have our projects. And so we're welcoming in a new administration here where I am in Hilo. The Department of Environmental Management has changed, and I am very hopeful that things in particular in Kona, where I see climate change as it's kind of like our canary in the coal mine in a way. I think is Kona. Its water resources. It's already a dry area,
Mm-hmm.
and in climate change, people say the drier areas will become drier and the wetter areas will become wetter.
Right.
And so that poses a very big challenge for how we handle our wastewater, because wastewater is a valuable resource. And so I feel like we're at a very important time where we have administration coming in, a recognition of climate change and things that are happening, and hopefully some changes will come to allow us to recycle more water, especially in West Hawaii. And I think that would make a huge contribution
Right.
in the future to
Right.
preserving our water
Right.
resources.
I think there's a general increase in awareness about these issues. I know you mentioned Hawaii Island and Oahu, and we didn't have a lot of changes politically in Maui County, but overall, I think Maui County has long been very progressive and very
Oh, yes.
invested in the environment. So I
Yeah.
don't think that's going to end anytime soon. I think there's just more and
No.
more interest and investments being made here. So.
Yes. Well, I even though I'm not on Maui, I still am very proud of the work that Maui County does, and that how it chooses to use its budget to support the community through nonprofits, and to put a substantial amount of money towards conservation, and really understanding that maintaining the beauty of that island affects everybody,
Right.
residents and visitors, economy, everything.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
Maui really is a leader in that way. And
Right.
I can only hope that the other islands will follow. And as we're able to recover our economy, that we can place new emphasis on preserving the environment and recognizing how important that is.
Right. It really is a matter of priorities. We're always going to
Mhm.
have a limited amount of resources, but it really comes down to the priorities. And I'm really proud of our Maui County government that,
Yeah.
provides more funding to nonprofit organizations and conservation than all of the other counties combined. And, it's
Hmm.
not, yeah, we like to brag about that, I think. but I think, as we go on in time, I think there is more awareness and connection with the natural environment and going through a pandemic and really understanding that we have to be more self-sufficient, self-sustaining, and encouraging
Hmm.
people to do that on an individual and family basis, not just as an entire island community. So, but we're
That's right.
coming up. Sadly, we're coming to the end of our hour already, and I can talk to you forever. But
Oh my
we're coming
gosh.
to the end. But I did want to thank our producers, Darif Wailuku, who is making our show possible. And if you like what this conversation today, we plan to have many more, and we have so many awesome people working in Hawaii and every island, and we can talk about what's going on here and how people can get involved and maybe do things in their own backyard. And so if you like what you saw today, please subscribe to our channel, Conservation Conversations Hawaii. So mahalo, Rhiannon, for joining us today, and I look forward to having you back again in person. So have a
Yay.
great 2021, and we'll see you again. Aloha.
Awesome. Aloha.